A few years back, I embarked on an adventurous solo journey into the remote backcountry of Alaska. The idea was to immerse myself in a long weekend of camping and fishing across various areas that my family, particularly my dad, had recommended. Having grown up listening to my father's captivating tales of hunting and backpacking in the small town outside of Anchorage where he was born and raised, it felt only natural to explore those landscapes firsthand. Despite being an experienced outdoorsman, I exercised caution and refrained from underestimating the challenges of the Alaskan wilderness. Instead of taking a plane to the isolated deep wilderness or venturing completely off the grid, I opted for known recreational areas, navigating back roads to create some distance while remaining within a mile or two of the next camper's haven. My chosen spot was an inlet along a river that my dad had touted as a supreme fishing location. However, much to my surprise, the fishing was uneventful on the first day. Though devoid of any human presence, there were signs of through traffic, possibly locals leaving behind minor remnants like bottle caps and scraps of plastic. Determined to uncover the secrets of the river, I trekked upstream for a couple of miles, finding deep pools where fish were visible, yet I couldn't get a single bite. Even after changing my fly setup, my luck remained elusive. Puzzled and feeling like I might be missing something, I observed an inexplicable spectacle as the fish suddenly went into a frenzy, darting in every conceivable direction. This unusual behavior contradicted the typical response of fish fleeing in unison from perceived threats. It seemed as if they were under the influence of an electric shock, a baffling occurrence that left me pondering its cause. Putting the peculiar incident behind me, I continued upstream and eventually had some success before the day's end. As I moved further upstream, the woodland transformed into a rolling meadow, where the water spread out, creating intricate channels flowing in various directions. In this idyllic setting, with the sun breaking through the clouds, I heard a strange buzzing noise intermittently. Initially dismissing it as my ears playing tricks on me, the buzzing persisted throughout the hour I spent in the clearing. I contemplated the possibility of someone with a quad or dirt bike in the distant valley, given the absolute silence around me. Yet, the curiosity waned, and as daylight was limited, I secured my catch, indulged in some light hiking, captured breathtaking photos on mild slopes, and gradually made my way back to camp without encountering any signs of human activity throughout the day. Coming back down the river gorge, I perceived a peculiar buzzing sound. As I descended, my attention was drawn to movement along the far bank. Peering behind the tree line, I thought I spotted someone. Curiosity and the unfamiliarity of my camping location prompted me to pause and wait for them to reappear. With intentions of friendly interaction, I aimed to discuss the river and potential fishing hotspots, given my stay for the next couple of days. However, no one emerged, and my unease grew. I shouted a greeting, but it went unanswered. Determined to unravel the mystery, I briskly made my way back to camp, glancing over my shoulder for any sign of the elusive figure. After a mile, with no one in sight, I entertained more rational explanations, perhaps shadows, branches, or even a curious animal. Approaching a bend in the river, I concealed myself in foliage and surveyed the trail behind me. To my surprise, I spotted the same individual, about a quarter-mile away, moving deliberately and quietly. The scene was almost surreal, observing him undisturbed in his element, unaware of my watchful eyes. After a few minutes, he noticed me, waved, and vanished into the trees. The encounter was strange, with the added peculiarity of his paramilitary appearance, suggesting a possible photographer with numerous pockets. Maintaining my pace, I left the mysterious figure behind and enjoyed the rest of the afternoon and evening by the campfire. I prepared a delightful dinner with freshly caught fish, reveling in the ambience under the stars. Reflecting on my father's past experiences in the same area, I marveled at the continuity of traditions. As fatigue set in, I secured my camp and retired to the tent for the night. In the tranquility of the night, with a roaring fire and a spacious canvas tent, I drifted into a peaceful slumber. However, an unexpected awareness jolted me awake. A strange light filtered through my closed eyelids. Initially, I suspected the figure from earlier using a flashlight near my tent, but upon opening my eyes, I found myself alone. The tent remained zipped, and the fire pit glowed dimly. My gaze then fixed on a distant light, approximately 15 feet away in the trees. Straining my ears, I detected no accompanying sounds, no engine hum, no footsteps. Moreover, the road didn't allow for a vehicle to be in that direction. Adding to the intrigue, the light seemed to descend from the sky, forming a solid pillar shooting vertically about 40 feet. Bewildered, I contemplated the surreal scene, questioning the reality of the moment for several minutes before succumbing to an uneasy uncertainty. Wondering if I was in the midst of an otherworldly encounter, I quickly dismissed the idea of aliens. The strange light vanished, fading to black, and the side of my tent was no longer illuminated. Being well versed in wilderness survival, I habitually carried a gun, and for my Alaskan expedition, I chose a Smith & Wesson 10mm due to the diverse array of predators in the region. I kept it within reach under my sleeping bag. The moment I grabbed the firearm, the light reappeared, this time directly above my campsite. A solid column of light, about 20 feet in diameter, bathed the area in a rich white glow. Despite my seasoned outdoorsmanship, I felt an overwhelming sense of powerlessness. Uncertain about the nature of the phenomenon, I leaped out of my sleeping bag and hastily began dressing. With my pistol secured in my waistband, I cautiously unzipped the tent, peeking out with one eye. The light was blinding, rendering me unable to look up, but I could still discern my truck and campsite clearly. The source of the light remained motionless, silently hovering above me. Suddenly, the buzzing sound returned, now closer and eerily familiar. Before I could process this information, the light extinguished once again. Without hesitation, I donned my jacket, laced my boots, and sprinted toward the tree line. While my camp was in a partial clearing, denser woodland offered better cover from whatever was above me. As I crashed through the thicket, branches left me scratched and battered, but the urgency to escape the luminous mystery prevailed. Reaching a hillside, I opted to climb a dead oak with thick branches. Though scraggly and gray, it seemed climbable, providing me with some refuge. As I ascended, the same pillar of light rekindled above my campsite. From my elevated vantage point, I could observe parts of my camp, my truck, and the unzipped flap of my tent. The light emanated from a single point, but its source remained obscured in the darkness. As the light started to move, following the path I had taken into the trees, it went off again. In the tree, I could hear it whining, a disconcerting sound distinct from the previous buzzing. Feeling cornered and out of options, I pulled out my pistol and waited. Every bullet was discharged into the light if it tried to spotlight me again. After a few minutes, it shut off at the base of the hill where I had veered off from the main path. Remaining there for an extended period, it eventually resumed laps around the forest, buzzing by me above the oak. Hoping that being elevated in a tree would keep me concealed, I endured the rest of the night with white-knuckled determination, gripping my pistol and vigilant against the enigmatic light. The luminous phenomenon continued to toggle on and off intermittently. At one point, I heard a voice shouting the same hello I had uttered toward the river earlier. It wasn't my voice, but a singular call, almost as if someone were taunting me. In response, I climbed a little higher into the tree and hunkered down, enduring the rest of the night. By dawn, I hadn't seen or heard anything for close to an hour. Seizing the opportunity, I descended and hastily made my way back to my camp, diving back into my sleeping roll to escape the biting cold that had settled after spending the night outdoors. Thankfully, nothing else disturbed me for the remainder of the trip. I later made contact with a family camping down the road, and while they hadn't observed the peculiar light, they confirmed hearing the buzzing occasionally in the afternoons. It was an odd detail, but it provided no concrete answers. As the trip concluded, I returned home and shared the bizarre experience with my father, who was equally perplexed. His inclination leaned toward a military operation, but neither of us could fathom why they would bother a solo camper armed with guns. The entire incident remained shrouded in mystery, leaving me with no clear direction to seek answers. Years later, I encountered an individual with a similar experience. He had been camping in the Four Corners area when his campsite was illuminated similarly to mine. Unlike me, he chose to wait it out until the light disappeared. Upon reporting the incident to the Forest Ranger Service the next day, he learned about illegal growing operations in the area. Local law enforcement apparently used drones to spot the farms at night, aiding in locating and raiding them. They apologized, explaining that the operator had likely mistaken my camp for being connected to the illegal grow operation. Comparing notes, our experiences shared striking similarities: the buzzing sound, the eerie silence, the intense light, and its phantom-like movements. Despite this revelation, I remain puzzled about who might have deployed a drone in the Alaskan wilderness in the late 90s. The incident had left me thoroughly shaken, and my lingering curiosity centered on whether it was a civilian or government program and whether there were any photos of me from that perplexing night. In Anchorage, there once stood a prominent house on 11th Avenue near downtown, featuring a grand multi-level deck with a hot tub on the top level. This conspicuous setup, visible from the street, garnered attention as a symbol of opulence. In its heyday, the dwelling was a haven for the affluent elite, frequented by oil corporation magnates and politicians. To passers-by, it exuded an air of celebrity lifestyle. While the exterior hinted at a luxurious gathering spot, the true nature of the house on 11th Avenue remained concealed from the average working-class residents. Initially perceived as a glamorous party venue involving gambling, drinking, and perhaps some illicit activities, the reality was far more sinister than the community speculated. The house's origins aligned with the rumors, a hub for indulgence and excess. However, as time unfolded, it transformed into something much darker, a hub for sex trafficking and blackmail. The culprits behind this nefarious operation were associated with a major corporation named VCO, a leader in metal manufacturing. The company's leaders, enamored by a lavish lifestyle, became entangled in the local cocaine scene, rubbing shoulders with politicians and their unsavory associates. The insatiable appetites of these individuals led to the establishment of an underage sex trafficking ring. Young girls, lured into addiction by cocaine, were confined to the house on 11th Avenue, becoming objects of abuse and exploitation. The disturbing truth behind this operation was shielded from public knowledge, as those involved wielded immense power and influence over the community. As VCO faced financial troubles in the early 2000s, it was acquired by CH2M Hill, a Colorado-based company. Simultaneously, brave individuals began to speak out against politicians and business leaders in Anchorage, revealing harrowing tales of kidnapping, rape, and hostage situations associated with the sex trafficking ring. Shockingly, each woman who came forward over the last 2 decades either succumbed to intimidation or mysteriously disappeared, preventing the exposure of these heinous crimes. The orchestrated cover-up extended beyond the involvement of local police and politicians. It was fueled by the corporate dynamics between VCO and CH2M Hill. Whether motivated by VCO safeguarding its image or CH2M Hill eliminating loose ends, the sinister activities conducted in the house on 11th Avenue remained shrouded in secrecy. The tale underscores the chilling extent to which corporations can exert control over a community, even to the detriment of justice and human rights. During my time working on the North Slope of Alaska in the oil industry, our tasks often required us to venture deep into the Alaskan Petroleum Reserve, an expansive and untamed tundra wilderness. The oil companies would construct lengthy ice roads in winter leading to exploration drilling pads. Our responsibility was to assess rock formations for their oil-producing potential after the initial drilling. One mid-January morning, with the sun absent for nearly a month and a half due to the intense polar nights, we found ourselves about 60 miles west of Alpine, Alaska, at a remote well site deep in the wilderness. After a week of completing our job, we were on our way back to camp to conclude our hitch and return home. At the entry and exit points of the ice roads, guard shacks ensured safety checks, given the lack of cell reception or radios beyond a certain distance. It was around 4 a.m., a time that held little significance in the perpetual darkness of the Arctic. Traveling back across the ice road, we encountered an unexpected sight illuminated by our headlights: a man in jeans, sneakers, and a hoodie jacket walking down the icy path in the wilderness at 4 a.m. in temperatures around -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Considering the possibility that he might need assistance, we approached him, but he didn't acknowledge us. His attire, though entirely inappropriate for the extreme weather, appeared warm and dry. Notably, he wasn't an Inuit person but of Caucasian descent. As we continued alongside him, trying to communicate, we detected an unusual acidic smell emanating from him. Attempting to make sense of the situation, some in our group speculated that he might be in shock from an accident. When a crew member reached out to help, the eerie encounter took a chilling turn. The man, seemingly unfazed by the cold, grabbed onto the outstretched arm with an intense and angry glare. He refused to let go, emitting a scream filled with hatred and rage. Reacting swiftly, we sped away, leaving the bizarre figure behind. After reporting the incident at the guard shack, we were met with skepticism, as the guard thought it might be a prank. Despite filing a report, the subsequent patrol found no trace of the mysterious individual or any signs of the incident. The unsettling experience left us with unanswered questions, as the guard dismissed it as a prank. Yet, the bruise on my colleague's arm was a tangible reminder that something inexplicable had occurred on that desolate ice road. To this day, the strange encounter lingers in my memory as one of the many peculiar stories from my time in the enigmatic Alaskan tundra. Years ago, a couple of friends and I were out squirrel hunting in a creek bottom. We were on this big wilderness camping expedition and had set up some tents. After Saturday morning's hunt, the day wore on into later afternoon. Now, the clouds built up, and we could hear some thunder muttering, getting closer and closer. Quickly, we grabbed a big tarp out of the back of my pickup, strung it up between the tents, having to repitch one of the tents to get it under cover. Once a year, we get the boys together for a big outdoor trip that lasts about a week. This requires us to keep a campsite that can support us for the duration of that time. No washouts, no wood shortage, nothing to cause consistent problems if it could be avoided. It's hard to describe how the camp looked. We had 2 tents facing one another, big old-style bell tents with external poles. The big, heavy tarps were strung up, supported by cut saplings, partially covered by both tents. We had the tarp pretty well staked down with the white nylon line, what we call trot line, staging the fire pit we dug out at the edge of the tarp, overhung so the smoke would clear with the storm. With the storm coming, there was going to be no more hunting, at least for now. So, we got the fire going, got a pot of coffee brewing, and something sweet cooking. I don't remember exactly what, but it was bubbling on the side of the fire. We built a fancy multi-layered spit that had 4 squirrels beginning to roast. One of my buddies was squatting down, turning them. All of us would have a shift rotating the spit until they were finished. The storm had been teasing, but now it finally hit, lashing rain, thunder, and lightning like crazy. We were snug and comfy, all congratulating one another on how cool we were camped out in the woods in a storm. No one had a pistol, we just had 3 shotguns. Mine was an 870 pump, and I remember mine was leaning up against one of the many saplings holding up our tarp. We weren't too concerned about camp intruders. The rain was going to keep most of the predators bedded down for the night. It was torrential, the kind of rain you can't even see in between. Between that and the firelight, no bears or wolves would be messing with us. Even then, we just spray them with our 12 gauges and then call it a night. We brought out lawn chairs for the big campout, the old style as was back around 1979. 2 of us were sitting in ours watching the third guy turn squirrels and tend to the coffee. Suddenly, and I mean so fast we didn't even see it happen, a man just stepped under our tarp and stood there with a rifle held in both arms across his body. He walked up one side of my tent and was just stepping under the tarp. Instant shock and pandemonium ensued. I reared back and collapsed my chair, trying to get the hell away from this guy. I'm scrambling for the shotgun. One buddy literally fell into the fire that he was tending to because it shocked him that bad, burned his hands and his face a bit, but his jacket took the brunt of the heat, thankfully. If he'd gotten severely burned, there's no way we'd be able to get him out of the woods and then into a hospital, not with a storm in the mud. Our other friend just jumped up and ran full tilt into his tent, knocking it all askew. He later told me he thought he brought a pistol. He was rooting around in his duffel bag, but came up empty-handed. The guy that stepped underneath the tarp starts yelling something like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, whoa." I get myself dead-angled from the chair and jumped up to my feet. I mean, we're dead meat. There's a guy with a gun right here. He's not brandishing it, though. He has this bolt pulled back and is still holding it across his chest. He's attempting to wave his own white flag of some kind. We quit hollering over one another and let the stillness creep over us. Even the friend in the tent poked his head out to get a look. It was a true standoff and the only one I've ever been in. If he'd been carrying that rifle in any other way, though, I think we would have killed him out of fear. A potential life sentence type of mistake. After things calmed down a bit, it turned out this guy was just totally lost. He was already lost when the storm hit and was now just wandering around in the heavy rain. He smelled smoke from the fire and the squirrel cooking, followed it right to our camp. His rifle was a bolt-action .22 with a magazine. He was just some daytime hiker messing around in the forest when trouble hit. He was harmless, but the whole situation and the guy itself just gave me the creeps. He had this ear-to-ear grin that seemed almost impossibly wide, almost like special effects or something. I could hardly look this guy in the face because it just weirded me out that much. I don't know if the firelight cast weird shadows on his face or what, but I was the only one who seemed to notice it. It didn't seem like he blinked much either, even with water dripping in his eyes. When the man saw how bad he had just scared all of us, he apologized profusely. We wound up loading up the guy in my truck and taking him out to the pavement and up to the pipeline where his car was parked, only about a half a mile on relatively flat land. It was an easy drive, so I risked it just to get him out of camp. The guy was totally unthreatening, but he should have called out before ducking under the tarp and maybe acted normal once he did. It scared us all half to death. I decided to drive north out of town. I was almost stopping randomly at different beaches. I stopped at one and was having a great time on the beach just by myself, watching the birds fishing and looking at the tide pools. A truck pulled up in the parking lot above me, and I didn't think much of it the first time. The truck then spun a Brody and left, heading north. I spent a lot of time at these remote trailheads, and you see all kinds of riffraff, local kids smoking pot, others hooking up, all kinds of manner of reckless driving, burnouts, brothers, whatever the parking lot will accommodate. These trailheads are typically local to some rural communities where there really isn't much to do, so that little extra stretch of pavement becomes its own form of recreation. I wandered further down the beach, and a few minutes later, that truck comes back. It parked at the overlook for a bit. The beach was probably about 50 foot lower in elevation than the parking lot, and there was a bluff. They just sat there, then they peeled out again heading off to the south. I was a bit creeped out now, and this time I started making my way back to the trail to get back to my car. I was wearing dark clothing, so I clung to the tree lines a bit for cover. I tried keeping a little foliage between myself and whatever line of sight they might have. Right about then, that truck comes back a third time. It parked with its headlights shining right towards me. As it was getting to be dusk, I just sat there. Then, for a third time, it peeled out once more. But this time, I could hear that it stopped right where my car was parked. I heard the engine shut off, and right then, every instinct in me told me to hide. I left the beach and went straight into the woods somewhat up the hill. Juneau has these big trees, and I found one that had been knocked down. I laid down on the far side of it. If they had a flashlight, they'd spot me in a second. Fortunately, my cell phone had really poor connection, and I wasn't armed. I didn't carry any weapons when I traveled by airplane. All the odds felt stacked against me in that moment. I was scared shitless at this point. Then I heard a slam. I knew that there were at least two people. They had waited a while, I guessed, to maybe see if I was coming back up the trail. Now they were starting down the trail. One of the men appeared to have this long object in his hand. I think it was a rifle, but in the fading light, it might have been a bat or something else. He was calling out as well, "Hello, where are you?" All of a sudden, I felt very much like I stepped into the most dangerous game. I remained hidden, my heart beating wildly. I waited until the men were well down onto the beach and then began climbing the hill up into the woods where I knew the parking lot to be. I tried not to make noise, but that was impossible. There were dried leaves and deadfall all over. I was making a hell of a lot of racket. Fortunately for me, I don't think they heard me. I got up to my car, and the truck freaked me out. It was fully tinted. There was no way to tell if anyone was inside the vehicle at the time. I started my car and tore out of there. I've hiked alone all my life and been in far more remote places than this, but never before or since had that same feeling that I was in some kind of grave danger. To this day, I don't feel like I overreacted, and I'm 100% positive that those men had something bad in store had they caught me. It was my second time hunting ever with my dad and two of his buddies. We were in southeast Alaska on an island. We had set up camp in the middle of a medium-sized cove that was shaped like a U. The shore was surrounded by a similarly shaped mountain range. As we went further inland, we had planned to stay for 4 days to deer hunt. On the first and second days, my dad and I climbed up a few hundred feet to several spots with absolutely no luck in finding anything but meandering old growth. In the evening of the second day, our group spotted a wolf emerging from the tree line across from the cove. It laid down on the shore, and after a few moments, another larger wolf came out and accompanied what we assumed to be its mate. They laid next to that first wolf, and then the first wolf moved a few yards away from them. Thus, we inferred that the largest wolf was the pack's alpha male. This was the first we'd seen or heard of them in our area, at least on this trip. On the morning of the third day, it was made obvious why we couldn't find any deer. The wolves were hunting as well. We didn't see any sign of them because they weren't leaving any scent or tracks. They were bringing down all the deer in the still-off hours, which kept the herds hypervigilant. One night, though, they did start howling aggressively. It kept up throughout the entire rest of the trip. Now, while movies and other media imply that wolves howl randomly and that you can always hear a single loud howl, that's not accurate at all. These wolves were howling with a purpose to scare the deer around the cove and then to corner them. The pack started howling right at the tip of the cove, their dissonant tones echoing over miles and miles. They began moving their way around and toward us. My dad and I went up once again since there was nothing else to do. This time we were a few hundred feet up when we heard the wolves howling again. But there was one howl louder than the rest and closer than the rest. We stopped below a fallen tree trunk to listen, and we heard the howl get closer and closer. I was carrying a bolt-action rifle. My dad told me to load a round. He pulled out a handgun and racked it as well, loudly trying to scare off that wolf. The howling drew closer up above us, and a few minutes later, I'm looking up the slope of a mountain through that old growth. I see an animal moving with its nose sniffing on the ground. The alpha wolf was not but 30 yards from us, following the scent of another animal. It had to have known that we were there by scent, sound, and sight, but for some reason just chose to ignore us. Needless to say, we didn't find any deer on that trip. I was a janitor at the University of Alaska Fairbanks for over 5 years while I was going to school. This is a little-known fact, but many students and faculty believe that the campus is totally haunted. Everyone has different reasons, from the creepy old legends about the ground it's built on to the rumors about the people who built it. Then there are just the good old-fashioned people dying on campus over the years. Whatever the reasoning, it's a pretty typical conversation to overhear about lights flickering, weird noises, etc. People just have weird experiences here and chalk it up to the paranormal. There was one guy who didn't hear any stories, was brand new, and simply didn't believe in ghosts or anything of the like. He got put on theater duty one night. This is a long shift wherein the janitor or janitors are isolated to one building for anywhere from 4 to 6 hours, or however long it takes to clean the entire facility, swap the trashes, and all that stuff. There's a second building behind the theater that's also part of that same duty. I forget the name of the building, but it stuck between the engineering building and the library. He quit that night on the spot during his shift. I was supervising a team at the time. He called me all frantic and panicked, saying he couldn't finish the building and was quitting immediately. He insisted that I needed to come down and get the keys right now. In the back of my head, I kind of knew what this was all about because I've seen and heard a few things myself while cleaning inside that theater. I heard a few stories after I asked around, but personally, I just really didn't care. The noises and the locked and unlocked doors and apparitions didn't stop me from having to pay my bills, so I tried to ignore it the best I could and continue to do my job. So, anyways, I went to get the keys from him. He was as white as a damn ghost himself, beads of sweat dripping down his face, shaking from head to toe, talking about seeing some human figure drift across the stage. I didn't really know what to say to him, so I kind of just said, "Yeah, that sometimes happens, man. It's just noises, though. Sometimes it's a light, sometimes it's the doors. You just get used to it." All he took off so fast and didn't stick around to talk to the boss. The boss ended up thinking I scared him off. He was a bit of a no-nonsense kind of guy, even though he's the one who initially told me about the ghostly encounters. It turned out someone actually hung themselves there on that stage, and I didn't find out until later. Years later, it was the winter of '97, I believe, and I was living in Alaska, serving in the National Guard as an 11 Bravo infantryman. I loved it, as some of you may know. A joint task force between all branches of the military began working on building a road on an island nearby, an Ed Island. The Marines spent the summer building the HQ. It was a series of plywood huts and the framework of a mess hall. When summer ended, the huts were just basically sheds. There was no electricity or running water. Me and 5 other members of my unit were called to active duty. We were tasked with living on the island for the winter, protecting the camp. Apparently, the local native youth would hop from island to island, vandalizing vacant logging camps and such. This was classified as a training mission for budget purposes. It seemed like it would be a good time, 6 months in the winter on a remote island, living in a plywood hut. At first, things were somewhat rocky. There were only going to be 4 to 5 of us on an island at a time, with a weekend rotation every 2 or 3 weeks for 1 or 2 of us. It took a couple of months before we had a real generator or propane to cook with, so we subsisted on MRE's 3 meals a day for quite some time. The worst was that there was only one outhouse in the entire camp, which was placed a few hundred yards away from our camp. To make it even worse, the higher-ups, for whatever reason, declared the ground sacred. We were not allowed to relieve ourselves on it. This means if we needed to take a piss or drop the kids off at the pool, we had to march down to the outhouse in the Alaskan winter. For the most part, I was loving it. We bonded together, told jokes, played push-up poker, and overall just had a grand time roughing it. To make a longer story longer, the hard part of the winter came, and so did the snow, lots of it. By that time, we had these weird heaters that ran on diesel fuel, so we were kind of cozy in those huts. However, the one facility left unheated was the outhouse. Not only was it freezing, but it was now filling up the bay that the boat used to bring the sewage truck over on had frozen. By the 3rd of the month, our stay in the entire outhouse's contents were dangerously close to rising above the toilet seat. It was disgusting, it was freezing. It became my nightmare to use. Give me a slit trench over an outhouse any day of the week. Even now, thinking of this massive frozen mound makes me cringe. I could still see the steam that would rise from the hole out of the vents of the porta potty after each use. So anyways, despite the bizarreness of the outhouse, it's not the scary part of the story. One night, as the 4 of us were laying around on our CS getting ready for bed, a few of us were listening to a book on tape that Doc had brought with him. I think it was called Contact. It was either that for entertainment or Art Bell's Coast to Coast radio show, the only English station that we could get on the radio. If you don't know who he is, check it out. It's all about aliens, Bigfoot, and other paranormal stuff. Well, we heard noises outside, and now that might not seem scary, but let me tell you, we hadn't heard many noises night or day since we've been there. There isn't a whole lot of action going on during the middle of nowhere, especially on a frigid island without much to offer for wildlife. We hadn't seen any animals or found any tracks the entire time we were there, and we had to do a fair bit of walking. At first, we thought it might be some native kids come to goof off and tag the place or set it on fire. It seemed logical. Before we came to this island, we've been given tours of nearby logging camps, which would have been decimated. We were warned that this is what they would do to our camp if we didn't protect it. If it was them, we were ready for them. Well, to be honest, no, we weren't. Who am I kidding? We would have wanted to lock and load and go on the offensive if it wasn't for the fact that we were on a quote-unquote training exercise. That meant we didn't even have ammunition. We had M16s, but nothing to go in them. This had been a non-issue up until this point because there had been a lack of danger. We were all no longer laying in our CS. Instead, we were getting dressed and discussing who it is that's going to go investigate with an unloaded rifle. Just then, we heard those same sounds come to our door. It was not human. We could hear them breathing loudly. Our PFC, who was the one who had been picked up to lead the charge, flat out refused. None of us blamed him either. We didn't want this to become some Alaskan version of Southern Comfort meets Predator, if you know what I mean. So we all sat in silence for 10 minutes or so until the huffing and snorting faded away. A few minutes afterward, we manned up and opened up the door. We immediately saw in the snow the largest wolf prints I've ever seen. I swear they were the size of a pie plate. Anything attached to those paws must have been the size of a small horse or at least a dining table. We jumped up to the task, thinking we might need to ward a pack of wolves away. We started with hanging a series of lanterns along the perimeter and then kicked on the generator for lights along the actual buildings. After that, we got fires going to burn off some of the cold, big roaring infernos and big steel drums. We used them during the storms to navigate our way to the outhouse. The wolves started howling as we worked. Some of the other guys said they were trying to flank us, using their howls to try to get us to move in that direction they desired. I got to admit, it almost worked. That piercing sound comes blaring out of a tree stand not 30 yards from you. Your first instinct is to bolt in the other direction. We all survived the night but made a request for ammunition that following morning.